Well, we, as you are aware, have been traveling through Luke's gospel for several months now. And most recently, we've been in Jesus' Sermon on the Plain, which actually begins with him hiking up a mountain to go pray with his disciples. But then he comes down that mountain and discovers that people have come from all over the place to be healed and to hear from him. And so after he does heal this crowd of people, he begins to preach to everyone about what it means to be a disciple, what life in God's kingdom actually looks like. And last month, we began by taking the sermon and sort of pulling it apart, bit by bit, week by week. And we began with Jesus' blessings and woes, Luke's version of the Beatitudes. Really, that section describes this authentic discipleship that involves faithfulness to Christ no matter our situation in life. And that often the ways of God have a sharp reversal of the world's value system. And then in the next section, we learned what might be Christ's most difficult call to his followers, to love our enemies. To be merciful because the God we worship is merciful. And then last week, Joe walked us through Jesus' call to generosity and reciprocity in our relationships, rather than judgment and hypocrisy. This sermon, week to week, as we've been looking at it, has been challenging for us to hear. I can tell you it's been challenging for your pastors too. And today, as we come to Jesus' conclusion of his sermon, we're going to see that, like most good sermons do, Jesus wraps up his sermon calling for a decision from the listener. He asks the crowd, now that you've heard all these things, do you really want to be my disciple? And I think he, excuse me, I think he continues to ask the same thing of us today, friends. I do. And the call of Christ is no less challenging in our day than it was 2,000 years ago. But I want us to remember, as we hear the conclusion of this sermon, that the one that calls us to follow him is good. And his demanding and challenging call to discipleship, it comes from a place of love, and it's for our flourishing. And so as we hear the end of the Sermon on the Plain, hear it that way this morning, friends. Luke 6:43 through 49, hear the word of the Lord. No good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For people do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they pick grapes from a bramble bush. The good person out of the good treasure of the heart produces good, and the evil person out of evil treasure produces evil. For it is out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks. So why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you? I'll show you what someone is like who comes to me, hears my words, and acts on them. That one is like a man building a house who dug deeply and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood arose, the river burst against that house but could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not act is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the river burst against it, it quickly collapsed, and great was the ruin of that house. This is the word of the Lord. So he basically says to this crowd, do you really want to be my disciples? And then he says, I'll show you what it looks like. I'll show you what real discipleship is. And he gives two images, two metaphors, a fruit-bearing tree and a home built on a strong foundation. Now, sometimes when you're reading the Gospels and Jesus is teaching in parables, it can be confusing. Sometimes his parables are a little obscure, and you're sort of left wondering, like, what am I supposed to understand about this story or this metaphor? That is not true today. Today, Jesus is just simple and direct. Simple and direct. He's being really clear. He tells them, we all know that good trees produce good fruit. You plant an apple tree, you're going to get apples. No one expects to pull grapes off a briar bush. No one thinks they're going to get an orange from a fig tree. And then he moves to home building. And he reminds his listeners how important it is to build your home on a strong foundation so that it's not going to come crashing down at the first storm. Everyone in the crowd, 2,000 years ago, and probably this morning when I read it, we're all like nodding along going, yep, got it. Nothing too hard to understand here. This is not rocket science. These images, however, they boil down to two simple but not easy truths. You want to be a real disciple? Real discipleship comes from the heart, and it demands our obedience. And so, truth number one, real discipleship comes from the heart. Just like you're not going to grab grapes off a briar bush, Jesus tells his listeners, tells us, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. It's who we are on the inside that matters, right? That's what's going to come out of us at the end of the day. And so if you're an apple tree, you're going to grow apples. And if your heart is devoted to Jesus Christ, then it's going to be a whole lot easier to follow the ways of Jesus. It comes from the heart. And honestly, like, we won't actually be able to pull off following Jesus any other way anyway. Speaking of John Calvin, Presbyterian church father, he said this. He said, there's nothing more difficult to counterfeit than virtue. Yeah. If it's not actually in you, you're not going to be able to fake it for very long. It's tough. Being a disciple of Jesus, it requires heart and soul transformation. And so you might be able to say all sorts of things like, well, I grew up in a Christian home. Or I go to church most Sundays. I'm a cradle Methodist. I'm a Presbyterian. I was baptized. I mean, the listeners in Jesus' audience could even say, I heard Jesus Christ preach in the flesh. But Jesus says, can we actually just talk about what's in your heart? What's happening on the inside of you? Because whatever's on the inside, that's what's going to come out. That's what's going to come out. So real discipleship comes from the heart, and then second, it demands our obedience. After Jesus talks about trees and hearts, he poses this question. He's like, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and then you don't do any of the things I've called you to do? Now, if that's not the most convicting question to all of us who claim the name of Christ in all of Scripture, I'm not sure what is. Lord, Lord, but then you don't do what I tell you to do. Here again, though, Jesus is just linking the inside with the outside. And I want you to notice, the verbs that we get in verse 47. He says, I'll show you what someone is like who comes to me, who hears my words, but then who acts on them. Real discipleship, it goes beyond just showing up and listening. It's about acting on what you've experienced of God's love. This isn't about being attracted to Jesus, but about putting into practice the things we've experienced in the gospel of grace. It's not about being compelled. It's about moving beyond those initial positive thoughts and feelings to actually doing what Jesus tells us to do. It's about surrender and obedience to Jesus as Lord of our lives. And to be fair, surrender and obedience, those are not fun words for us. Now, Jesus describes the difference between two different people, right? Who build a house. One who does the hard work, we're told to dig out a really strong foundation, and one who doesn't. And when the storms of life come, and to be clear, the storms of life come for us all, only the one who has come to Jesus, heard the message of Christ, and then actually put that message into practice, only that one has any sort of staying power when suffering hits, when the storms of life show up. Only one builder has any hope of weathering the storms. And that's because obedience to the ways of God, it not only transforms us into people that look like Jesus Christ, but obedience makes us resilient in crisis. It makes us resilient. And if we hope to be people that are resilient in crisis, that have staying power when things get really hard, if we want to be the kind of people that have something to offer the world when everything hits the fan, we're going to get that by developing the kind of character that's produced in us by being obedient to the things Christ has called us to do. And so it begs the question this morning, and I will ask it of you. Where do you need to be obedient in your life? You know it. Where do you need to be obedient? Where in your life have you found yourself saying, Lord, Lord, but not actually doing the thing you know Christ has called you to do? Friends, it's become really commonplace in our world for people, I think, to just think about Jesus a lot or think about religion a lot. They sort of have this detached intellectual appreciation for religion more broadly. That's fine, I guess. A lot of people just engage God, I think, more like a therapist, someone they reach out to when they feel sad, or they pray to when they need something. But other than that, I think a lot of people, they just live however they want to. They do whatever they want. They add in faith sort of on the side. And this way of faith, if you can even call it that, it has become really prevalent in our culture. It has. So prevalent, in fact, that researchers had to figure out what to call it. And so about 20 years ago, they typed this sort of faith as moralistic therapeutic deism. That's their best attempt to pin it down. Moralistic because, right, you should be good and nice. You should be a good person. So moralistic. Therapeutic is that, God is kind of like our cosmic therapist, and he's there when we need him. And of course, since our whole goal is to just be happy, and our whole goal for our children is that they'd be happy, we need a good therapist. And then deism, God's real, God exists, but God's distant. He's out there somewhere, and he doesn't really demand too much from us. It's not too hard. Now, I got to tell you, I think this is probably the fastest and saddest growing religion in our time, at least in our culture. Maybe not worldwide, but definitely in the American West. But let me just say something that is hard to say and probably harder to hear. If that's what amounts to your discipleship journey, if you hear that description and you're like, oof, that hits a little too close to home, then I have to tell you, you have got to take a closer look at your foundation of your house, back to Jesus' metaphor. Because that is actually not what discipleship is. It's not. It's not. I think there's some spiritual danger, and when trouble hits, you'll know it. And I say that with no shame, friends. I just feel like we got to talk about it honestly. God is not your therapist. There was an article a few years back in the Christian Century, came out kind of during COVID times, and it just recorded a conversation between two really incredible pastoral theologians, Will Willimon and Stanley Hauerwas. And they were talking about the changing culture in our world that's sort of infiltrated the church. And they were basically arguing that some of our models of pastoral care have become deeply corrupted just by the sheer influence of the world on the church, and the church sort of just absorbing it over time. And the problem being that a lot of our churches end up making self-absorbed people just more self-absorbed. It's a damning article. I'd encourage you to read it. There's some hot takes, to be sure. But these are incredible pastoral theologians, so they're worth reading. But here are a couple lines from it. They explain that more and more today, people are encouraged to believe that the purpose of being born is to be free, to self-construct your life as you please. But eventually, that burden becomes unbearable. They find it impossible to choose their way into a life worth living. And then the other responds, I sometimes think that contemporary North American Christians are so beset by personal psychological problems because the church has failed to give us any assignment more interesting than the care of our own souls. Whew. Zing. Now, for the record, the last several weeks, in this sermon on the plane we've been dissecting, we have heard Jesus call us into the kind of life that is incredibly costly and deeply beautiful and much bigger than the care of our own souls, to be sure. The kind of discipleship that loves its enemies, that refuses to judge others, that's willing to get out of the way and push others ahead, that goes to do good to those who have hurt us, a discipleship that is generous and has integrity, that's marked by the mercy of God. And compared to what is happening in our larger world, and especially in the political arena right now, oh my goodness. What Jesus demands of his disciples, I mean, it's absolutely outrageous. It's outrageous. I mean, this is not like generic goodness Jesus is calling us to. It's like a lay down your life for others mandate. And if we actually take him up on it, it looks dramatically countercultural. It really does. And it's not just a little bit dangerous and risky. Remember, it got him killed. But it does look like mercy and grace, and it looks like the face of God. Will Willimon, he had a congregant once who was sick and likely dying in the hospital. And he went to see her, and while she was lying there pretty miserable, sort of in a moment of self-pity, she told him, she said, I'm lying in this bed, not sure if I'm going to make it out of this alive. I'm frightened and I'm worried. And Jesus has the nerve to waltz in here and suggest that I ought to single-handedly fund the church's food ministry? As sick as I am, I thought, others should be looking after me, not me looking after them. So she's telling her pastor about this encounter. And so he turned to her and he said, well, how did Jesus respond? And she said, well, as far as I can tell, Jesus said to me, I don't really care. What did you think you were getting into when you were baptized? And so, friends, I will end this sermon as Jesus did. May you give your whole, entire heart to Jesus Christ, for you will never regret such a gift. It will absolutely cost you. It will cost you everything. And it will ruin your whole life. And by ruin, I mean it will ruin the life you thought you were going to lead. And instead, you will lead a life that Christ has called you to and actually made you for, which will be outrageous and beautiful and like nothing you could have possibly imagined and like nothing you could do on your own. Do you want to be his disciple? Amen.